President Donald Trump survived another assassination attempt. What could lead someone to do this? Welcome to Sharpening Arrows, where we train teens to think biblically about life and politics. I'm your host, Victor Jakes. Now, before we get into today's show, which is on the serious side, I want to tell you something that's slightly less serious. At the dinner table a few nights ago, my kids brought up something that I simply don't have an answer for. I know I host a podcast that's supposed to provide the answers, but this topic is my Achilles heel, or in this case, my Achilles handshake. My kids were talking about dabbing people up, which I have to admit, I don't really understand. It's something about slapping hands. Apparently, as a teenager, I missed these classes. No, I was not the cool kid. I was taught to shake hands. You know, you stick your hand out, you have a nice firm grip, and you shake someone's hand, not to slap or pull at someone. And then my children recounted in vivid detail, not the passages that they're memorizing, not the Bible verses they're memorizing. Oh no. But the time that I saw a chaplain for my National Guard unit at church one day. Great guy. Went up to greet him, hadn't seen him in years, literally years. And oh no, he's doing something with his hands. I just don't understand. Don't worry though. My kids did. You see, he was trying to dab you up, Dad. No idea what that means. And so I simply stuck my hand out awkwardly. So if I ever see you and you want to say hi in some sort of cool way and it becomes very awkward, yes, it's me. It's not you. So remember, kids, your parents aren't trying to embarrass you. Like me, they simply probably don't know any better. But seriously, somebody give me some handshaking lessons. All right, this is a bit of a unique podcast. We are going to discuss ideas and current events. We do not want to shield our teens and preteens from the bad events in the world and bad ideas. We want to walk alongside them and train them to think. That's how we as parents sharpen our arrows. If you want to watch, no, I will not be giving a demonstration of how awkward I am at shaking hands. YouTube.com/@sharpening-arrows, YouTube.com/@sharpening-arrows. All right, let's get into the topic. Over the weekend, Cole Allen, a 31-year-old man, attempted to enter a ballroom where President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and several top administration officials were having dinner. Allen wanted to kill them. Now, fortunately, thank you, Lord, Secret Service stopped him before he gained access to the ballroom, but shots were fired. It seems like Allen got off at least one shot and hit a Secret Service officer in his bulletproof vest. The officer fortunately survived and returned fire, and Allen was captured. I do not believe he was actually hit by a bullet. On Monday, he was charged with 3 felonies: attempting to assassinate the president, transporting a firearm and ammunition with intent to commit a felony, and discharging a firearm during a crime of violence. All right, let's have our first pause point. This is another unique thing about this podcast. I encourage you to actually stop the podcast because parents, remember, you are your child's most important teacher, and discuss these things. So, what have you heard about this, and how does it make you feel? It's a disconcerting event. So I think it's important to have time to talk about it and to be able to express even a whole range of feelings about something like this. All right, Trump wanted to continue the event, which was the White House Correspondents' Dinner, but Secret Service, unsurprisingly, nixed the idea. All right, so we're going to get into 3 issues today. It's going to be a little bit different of a structure because we don't have... Anyway, we're going to talk about some ideas, but I just want to kind of preview the 3 things we're going to talk about. First, are most would-be assassins or mass shooters mentally ill? Second, the motivation in this case. And then third, what could lead someone to do this? All right, let's get into the first topic. After the shooting, Trump was on CBS's 60 Minutes program, and he said he was a Christian believer. and then he became an anti-Christian, and he had a lot of change. He was probably a pretty sick guy. And this isn't specifically about what Trump said, because there's kind of different ways you could take this idea of a sick guy. Obviously, attempting to assassinate the president makes you a sick person. But after a mass shooting or an attempted assassination, you're going to hear a lot of this language. Oh, this person was twisted, or they had a screw loose. And what they're trying to get at is this person was mentally ill. And we don't really know if that was the case in this situation definitively. But after an event like this, or after a mass shooting, you'll often hear it almost dismissed as, well, this person had a mental illness. And I want to have a pause point. Why is it appealing to think that a would-be assassin or a mass murderer is mentally ill? All right, first we have to acknowledge that sometimes it is the case that someone does seem to have a mental illness when they go and commit a horrible crime. They have a history of paranoia, of being in and out of mental facilities. So that certainly can be true. But I also want to think about the implications of just kind of dismissing it out of hand. Well, because they committed this crime, they must be mentally ill. Why is that appealing to people? Well, first, if the criminal is mentally ill, then there's not something society more broadly needs to fix. It was just this individual. The problem is confined to this specific person, not society more broadly. Look, we have 330 million people in America. You can't control every single individual. And if it's a mental illness, then it goes in that box of, well, that was just the one random person. And the second reason that this idea is appealing is that it minimizes sin or human evil. Someone can simply think, well, I would never do that because I'm not mentally ill. And oftentimes in cases like this, the root problem is actually sin. And that's a human problem. That's a mankind problem, because all have sinned. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And see, when you dismiss things like this as, oh, it's just mental illness, it kind of sounds like, oh, it's an accident. Oh, someone just made a mistake. It was outside of their control. But sometimes, not always, obviously mental illness is a real thing, but sometimes the problem is human evil. And that's a much deeper and harder thing to confront. And it is oftentimes something that requires something of us as members of society to change. So what Cole Allen did was obviously sick and wrong, but I think it's a mistake to believe that he was mentally unstable. And again, we don't know everything, so subject to change. But let's look at what we do know about him. This is from the New York Times. 2013, Mr. Allen enrolled in the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. That's an elite research university in Pasadena, California. At the time, according to federal data, Caltech admitted less than 11% of its graduate applicants. There, he studied mechanical engineering and graduated with a 3.0 GPA, according to his LinkedIn profile. Again, so you're not crazy and getting accepted to Caltech and then graduating from Caltech. So there is certainly a level of intelligence here. The summer of 2014, again, this is from the New York Times. He did a summer internship at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, according to his LinkedIn profile. After graduating from Caltech in 2017, Mr. Allen spent several years working as a mechanical engineer, a self-employed video game developer, and a college test prep tutor, according to his LinkedIn profile. As other outlets have reported, he was even Teacher of the Month in December 2024. Again, I think this lends credence to the idea that, no, this was not someone who just simply had a screw loose, who just happened to go off. This is a man who has a history of intelligence, of thoughtfulness. In 2022, he enrolled at California State University Dominguez Hills to pursue a master's degree in computer science. The university said in a statement on Saturday it had a record of a student matching Mr. Allen's name, earning a degree in 2025. That's simply not the profile of someone who's mentally unstable. Oh boy. Because if it's not simply someone who's mentally ill or mentally unstable, we actually have to look and find out how in the world could this actually happen. Now, we don't have to guess because Allen sent him out a manifesto explaining his actions. and parents, you can decide if this is appropriate for your teen or preteen to read or not, but I'm just going to kind of pop through some of the highlights here. Lowlights, I guess, would be a more accurate term. Ironically, Allen starts by apologizing to lying to his parents and colleagues about where he is. You kind of have misplaced priorities here. If you are planning to murder someone, you shouldn't be apologizing for lying to someone about where you are. You should be apologizing, for wanting to murder someone. But this is what Allen said about why he did this. I'm quoting here from the manifesto. On to why I did any of this. I am a citizen of the United States of America. What my representatives do reflects on me, and I am no longer willing to permit a pedophile, rapist, and traitor to coat my hands with his crimes. Well, to be completely honest, I was no longer willing a long time ago, but this is the first real opportunity I've had to do something about it. And with those insults and pejoratives, he's referring to President Donald Trump. And I want to leave aside for a moment his claims about Trump, which I think are very clearly false. But sometimes we have to take arguments apart and we have to set parts of an argument aside, not because we agree with them, but to get at another part of the argument. And we don't want two moving parts. We just want one part to examine. So leave aside his claims about Trump. And even though what he did was very wrong and very evil, I don't want to simply dismiss out of hand his argument. He's a citizen of the United States of America. What his representatives do reflects on him, and he doesn't like what they're doing. Okay, here's a pause point. Which of the great 8 questions would you use in response to his argument here? And as a reminder, the great 8 questions are questions we put in our mental toolbox to help us when we encounter arguments like this. Question 1 is, what happens next? Question 2, has this been tried before? Question 3, is there a principle involved? Question 4, what are the trade-offs? Question 5, what do you mean by that? Question 6, is this an appeal to emotion or logic? Question 7, am I focused on the speaker or the argument? And question 8, what does the Bible say? Now, remember, there are lots of ways to attack arguments. And so just because I don't choose the question that you may have selected does not mean you are wrong. Now, the question that I would start with is question 3. Is there a principle involved? Because again, we're setting aside what he says about Trump, but here's the principle that he's establishing. If my elected officials do something that I consider seriously immoral, I should shoot them. That's his claim. Okay, so we've identified it. Now we can debate the merits of it. Let's go to question 1. What happens next? If this claim is valid, if my elected officials do something I consider seriously immoral, I should shoot them. What happens next? If everyone in the country takes that claim to heart, well, there's going to be a bloodbath because conservatives consider abortion to be the taking of an innocent human life. Many leftists believe America is racist at its core. If that principle were valid, people wouldn't just be justified in shooting elected officials. They'd be obligated to do so. And of course, that would be morally wrong and a complete disaster. Those are failed states when people are shooting at each other in order to determine political control. So again, if you hear an argument, identify the principle in the argument and test it. If it leads to absurdity, if it leads to mass murder, reject it. And of course, we can always, not always, because the Bible doesn't speak on every single political topic, but if the Bible does speak on a topic, we can go to the Bible and take the shortcut and just get to the answer. So let's look at what the Bible says. That's question 8. Well, Exodus 20, one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not murder. See how easy it is when you just go to the Bible and like, all right, God made the universe. God knows how it works best. What does he tell me to do? Oh, thou shalt not murder? Okay, this was a bad decision. And we can go a little further here into Romans 13. This is Paul writing, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. So, what was this would-be assassin trying to do? He was rebelling against the authority. Again, that's another violation of the Bible. Okay, so you may have a follow-up question here. I think this is a natural follow-up question, and actually an important follow-up question. Okay, well, if everyone's supposed to be subject to the governing authorities, then was it biblically justified to have the American Revolution? You see, the Americans, the colonists, rebelled against the British, the governing authority over them. Therefore, they violated the Bible. All right, let's have a pause point. How would you respond to this argument? And this might be a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it's an important one. All right, first of all, government isn't the highest authority. Jesus, Peter, Paul, and most of the disciples died because they disobeyed the governmental authority. So we can know from the actions of Paul. Remember, Paul is writing, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, and Paul spends much of his life in prison for ticking those governing authorities off. So there has to be a higher principle at work. And there is. First, we follow God. Then we follow the government in the areas where the government is supposed to have a role. So we know that there is a level of authority higher than the government. Second, we can see biblical examples of Israelites throwing off oppressive regimes. You just go through the Old Testament before the establishment of the kingdom of Israel. We have Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. There's Deborah and Barak and Samson and Gideon. These are all Israelites that God used to throw off oppressive regimes. And here's a bit of background. This is from gotquestions.org. The colonists saw the war as a defensive action, not an offensive war. And it is true that in 1775 and 1776, the Americans had presented the king with formal appeals for reconciliation. And these peaceful pleas were met with armed military force and several violations of British common law and the English Bill of Rights. So it wasn't just that the colonists were out of nowhere saying, we're breaking away. They were saying, hey, our rights are being violated. You're violating the law. And instead of responding in a respectful way, in 1770, the British fired upon unarmed citizens in the Boston Massacre. At Lexington, the command was, don't fire unless fired upon. The colonists therefore saw themselves as defending themselves after the conflict had been initiated by the British. All right, and here's the fourth point. I think this is really important. Romans 13 is written to Christians as individuals, not as units of state. And so what was happening with the colonists was not individual colonists taking pot shots at King George. The colonists weren't rebelling as individuals. They were rebelling within their established governmental units. So if you go back and you look, who is actually doing the breaking away? The 13 colonies. It's not George Washington as an individual, Benjamin Franklin as an individual, John Hancock as an individual. No, they're representatives of the government. And so another way to think about this is the Bible says not to murder. And yet, if you work for the government and you execute someone, you intentionally take a life. And there's a difference there because obviously the person who's executed is guilty of something. So it's not an innocent life. But it would be wrong for that same individual to shoot the murderer whenever they wanted. So what explains the difference? How can a person work for the government and have it be okay to execute someone, but not take that same action in a private capacity? Okay, again, there's a distinction here between the government and an individual. It's why an individual working for the government, it can be okay for them to execute someone, when an individual in their personal capacity, that wouldn't be appropriate. Okay, well, so when is it appropriate to rebel against the government? And I'm not going to dive too much into this, but I would encourage you to look at the Declaration of Independence, because the founders actually dive into this. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, they actually talk about this is why it's really important that we write these down, because this is a really big step. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, protecting individual rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And just for time's sake, I'm not going to get in there, but they talk about the long train of abuses and usurpations. So it's not for light and transient reasons. They didn't just feel like it. It wasn't just, oh, this annoyed me, I'm done. No. And the takeaway for us today, this is really important. If you can use ballots to remove a political leader, bullets aren't appropriate. You have to understand that for most of human history, political conflicts were settled by who was stronger, who was better at warfare, who could kill their opponent. That is a miserable, miserable way to live. What a blessing to live in a country where for 250 years we have said, yes, we are going to have disagreements. We are going to have political differences, but we're going to settle those with ballots, not with bullets. And so if you can remove a political leader with a ballot, you should not be using a bullet. All right, before we continue, let me tell you about Mama Bear Prayers, a podcast for moms who are knee-deep in dishes and training their teens. Whether you were in the carpool lane or the coffee line, host Charity Rios wants to come alongside you and help you grow deeper in your relationship with Jesus. Now, as every parent knows, raising kids can feel a lot like a ping pong game. You bounce from moments of joy to moments of deepest concern. Combine this with the busyness of life, especially here in the spring, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and even isolated. As the mom of 4 very busy boys, Charity knows this firsthand, and it's why Mama Bear Prayers exist, to support moms who are on the journey of raising kids. God works through prayer, so check out Mama Bear Prayers today. All right, let's get to the third question here. What could possibly lead someone to do this? Again, as I read through the manifesto of the shooter, he does not strike me as someone who is simply mentally unstable. I don't think you get a degree from Caltech in that condition. Doesn't mean the person's wrong. He's obviously wrong. Very, very wrong. But let's look at the reason that he says that he did this. And we kind of covered a bit of that reason already, is that he talked about this idea that, well, I'm a citizen of the United States and what my representative is doing reflects on me and I can't stand this anymore. But then he has a section of responding to objections that people could raise. And this is the first one. And again, this is the shooter writing. Objection 1. As a Christian, you should turn the other cheek. Rebuttal. Turning the other cheek is for when you yourself are oppressed. I'm not the person raped in a detention camp. I'm not the fisherman executed without trial. I'm not a school kid blown up or a child starved or a teenage girl abused by the many criminals in this administration. Turning the other cheek when someone else is oppressed is not Christian behavior. It is the complicity in the oppressor's crimes. Okay, I don't have time to go through and talk about the things that I believe he is referencing, other than to say I encourage you to do so, because the things he is saying or accusing the Trump administration or Donald Trump specifically of doing are wildly out of context, if not just completely wrong. I really want to focus on this idea of turning the other cheek when someone else is oppressed is not Christian behavior. It is complicity in the oppressor's crimes. Do you hear that? The oppressor's crimes. Okay, we're going to unpack that in just a little bit, but let's have a pause point. Is there a group of people in America Black Americans, women, Muslims, people who claim to be the opposite sex, who are oppressed. Okay, is there a group of people who are oppressed? Okay, that's really important because I want you to understand the thought process behind the terms that this guy is using. This idea of oppressor, of the oppressor and the oppressed comes from critical theory, a radical Marxist-based theory that divides people into arbitrary groups. With Marxism, it was economic, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie. So what the Marxist view of the world is, you look at the world and you say there's group A and there's group B. Most often, the way we've most often heard about this is critical race theory, where it divides people by race. Now, this is really funny, of course, because there's more than two races, but that's what they do. So the critical theorists come in and they say this group is oppressed, and they're oppressed by the oppressors. The oppressors, this line of thinking goes, obtain their success by creating systems of power to advantage themselves at the expense of those in the other groups. Now, because oppressors hold their power unjustly, activists believe, members of the oppressed group are justified in doing anything, including assassination, to fight back. Okay, so that's the worldview behind this assassin. And I don't have time to fully get into how crazy this is. I'm just going to point out three quick things. First, does truth exist? If someone ever is talking about this, or you start recognizing this language of oppressor, oppressed, does truth exist? That's the very most important, most foundational thing to try and establish. Is there absolute truth? Because critical theory holds there is an absolute truth, only systems of power. So we want to establish that yes, truth exists. And if they try and say, well, no, actually, the truth is just a system of power that the oppressors put in place to disadvantage the oppressed, then you say, well, how do we know that your beliefs are true? Right? Because if you say there's no absolute truth, that the person saying that doesn't have any leg to stand on when they say this is how the world actually is. And second is, I want you just to note the dichotomy here of, are we going to treat people as individuals? Are we going to judge them on the content of their character? Or are we going to treat them as a group member? And then this is the third thing, is that look at the results that happen. What happens when we treat someone as an individual? Well, we look at their character. We look at their decisions. We judge them based on what they have done. If you start treating people as simply interchangeable members of a group, that is what leads to things like attempting to assassinate President Trump. That is what leads to things like justifying Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, because according to this line of thinking, Israel is the oppressor. And so the oppressed, supposedly oppressed, are justified in doing anything, including rape and murder, to throw off their oppressors. And that leads us to our final pause point. Where would anyone come up with an idea this crazy? Well, remember when I said that this man went to Caltech? College campuses are filled with this critical theory trash. And you combine that with Democrats labeling Trump a king, a tyrant, a Nazi, and we are indeed living in dangerous times. What a blessing that as Christians, our hope is ultimately found in Christ, even as with his strength, we stand for truth. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on YouTube or share it with your friends and Christian community. Be courageous like Charlie, stay sharp, and give God the glory. I'll see you next time.